Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully you are here to learn about House Bill 15 and how it's transforming energy policy here in Ohio. My name is Chris Tavener. I'm General Counsel for the Ohio Environmental Council, and I'll be here to talk about some of the really great stuff that's in HB 15, as well as a little bit of a primer on energy policy here in Ohio, to give you a little bit of background information for those of you who may not be as familiar with how our energy system works. That'll be the super short version. We've done longer versions before, and if people are interested in the longer versions, we can send you that recording. But this is mostly to just give you the background information you'll need to know for HB 15. If this is your first time joining the Ohio Environmental Council for our webinar, we are a 501c3 statewide advocacy organization whose mission is to protect the environment and health of all Ohio communities through legal and policy advocacy, decision maker accountability, and civic engagement. I am joined today by Kevin Schimpf, an attorney at DickinsonWright. Kevin, I'll let you very briefly introduce yourself and your firm.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for having me. My name is Kevin Schimpf. I am an associate attorney at the law firm Dickinson-Wright here in Columbus, Ohio. Dickinson-Wright is a national law firm with 24 offices across the country and in Canada. In Ohio, we have a government affairs practice group headquartered here, and we do a lot of work on energy policy at the state level, whether that's at the State House or at the PUCO. So excited to be here, and I'm happy to talk about House Bill 15 today.
Thanks, Kevin. So now my slides aren't working. There we go. So I already discussed the OEC's mission, but for those who don't know, we also have a collective vision of a clean, healthy Ohio where our democracy empowers all communities to thrive in harmony with the environment, and we also are very values driven in the work that we do. So if you're new to learning about the OEC, we definitely encourage you to learn more about the work we do outside of energy work as well, which includes work on water issues, lands work, democracy, and lots of communications work. And then obviously we have our law center as well. And our law center engages in a variety of these issues in various legal venues, including the Public Utilities Commission that Kevin just mentioned. And we're excited to have you today because the law center is also committed to educating people on the various legal and policy issues that impact Ohioans in the environmental space. So we're going to start with a very brief history lesson in Ohio utility regulation. But before we dive into that, I want to make sure that for the attorneys on the call, you are ready for the CLE needs that the things you need to get your CLE credit. So if you are an Ohio attorney and you're seeking CLE credit, first make sure that you registered for a CLE credit for this course. Throughout the session, there will be a few polling questions that appear just to make sure that you are participating and engaging. If you're not an attorney, feel free to participate in those polling questions as well. They're general questions for everyone who might be interested. And then at the end of the session, for those of you who are seeking CLE credit, I'll send you an email confirming your CLE number, as well as just making sure, confirming that you completed the course. And then I'll be submitting your credit to the Supreme Court within the next few weeks. We're actually still waiting on confirmation for approval for this webinar from the Supreme Court because this bill passed just a few weeks ago. We wanted to make sure that you all had the opportunity to learn about it in real time. So we're still waiting on the approval. I don't have any questions that we're going to not get approved, but I'll confirm with everyone once that happens. So now we'll dive into that history lesson about Ohio utility regulation. So this is the really, really quick version on how Ohio's electric system works. So a few decades ago, Ohio's electric grid was complete regulation. So you could have one company that owned and operated electric generation, as well as the distribution of electricity to your home, which those companies were regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, but it resulted in some situations where, companies were not necessarily playing by market forces. You would have a company that's owning a coal plant, and then they're biasing the use of that coal plant to send electricity to their customers, and even if that may have actually been more expensive. And so that sort of system kind of fell out of favor as a good system for us to run our electric grid. So in the early 2000s, Ohio's legislature decided to deregulate generation in the sense that a regulated distribution utility, so AEP Ohio, if you live in Columbus, or up in the Cleveland area, the Akron area, you might have First Energy, or down in Cincinnati, you might have Duke. Those companies can no longer own electric generation. And so as a result, we have market forces that are playing for electric generation, while the distribution of electricity to your home is regulated by the PUCO, and that corporation that owns your distribution of your electricity isn't owning that coal plant, that solar farm, that natural gas plant. And importantly, all businesses can be owned by the same parent company, which results in some weird webs of corporate, connections. But the important thing is that there is that corporate separation that's going on. So Columbus, you've got AEP Ohio, that's the distribution utility, and that's run by a corporation. And then you've got AEP Energy, which does own some power generation, but they have to be separated, and there's a variety of rules that play into that. That's important for this conversation and some of the really important results of HB 15. So some other basic concepts. The Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, or the PUCO, is that entity that regulates electric distribution utilities in Ohio. There are some electric distribution utilities that are exempt from PUCO regulations, such as cooperatives in rural communities of Ohio, as well as municipal utilities. They don't have to follow all the same rules as PUCO regulated utilities, but in general, the vast majority of Ohioans live in an electric distribution utility territory. And so the PUCO regulated electric distribution utilities through a variety of different mechanisms, such as rate cases, setting the base rates for distributing electricity, and other mechanisms such as electric security plans, grid modernization cases. There are audits, a whole bunch of different mechanisms that kind of play out. And those systems have now changed as a result of HB 15 as well. We'll get to that. And then the other quick history lesson that I'm sure if you have been tuning into OEC stuff for many years, you've probably heard us talk about HB 6. We've been talking about it for 6 years now. Wish I didn't have to keep talking about it, but it's still relevant to what's happening in the electric policy space today. So HB 6 back in 2019 did a whole number of things, including bailing out some nuclear plants, but it also bailed out 2 coal plants, one of which was in Indiana. And the bailouts of those coal plants is what's central to the story that we're talking about today. So I talked about deregulation earlier, where electric distribution utilities aren't supposed to own generation. Well, there's been one exception over the past few decades where electric distribution utilities in Ohio have still had ownership of these coal plants, these OVEC coal plants, they're known as the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation. And through a variety of mechanisms, we're essentially getting a bailout from Ohio ratepayers to help fund and subsidize the continued use of those plants. And so, as you can see, HB 6 actually wrote into statute that bailout that had been PUCO approved prior. And that was one of the biggest issues with HB 6 was these bailout of these dirty coal plants. And HB 6, as many of you know, also gutted Ohio's clean energy standards. There's a whole host of things wrong with that. If you want to learn more about all of the fallout of the HB 6 scandal, there is actually now a documentary on HBO all about it. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Go watch the documentary if you want to learn more. So, OVEC. Let's dive a little bit deeper into what OVEC is. So, OVEC exists because these 2 coal plants were originally constructed to power nuclear diffusion plants for the Atomic Energy Commission for weapons-grade uranium. So this is back in 1952. These are Cold War era plants being constructed at the time by the Atomic Energy Commission down near Piketon, Ohio, is where the diffusion plant was. OVEC had a supply contract for electricity for the uranium enrichment plant all the way through 2003. But then the groups that were funding OVEC decided to continue operating these 2 plants that at that point were already 51 years old, and renewed their power agreement in 2011 all the way through 2040. So if it went all the way through 2040, these plants would be almost 90 years old. in Ohio, demand for electricity was low in 2011. Shale gas had already been booming, but these two coal plants, these partners chose to continue operating these 50-year-old plants moving forward. And then economics kind of resulted in this situation where they started asking for these bailouts of the costs from ratepayers. So a simple way to put this is that these companies made an investment decision to invest funds in two coal plants at some point. And you can see the list of the companies at play, and you may recognize the name of some of these, but the reality is OVEC is a relic of the past. When we had regulated distribution utilities also owning generation, OVEC was given an exception to the otherwise blanket rule. Ohio Edison Company, Ohio Power Company, AEP Ohio, you've got Duke Energy Ohio down in Cincinnati, and then AEP itself, the parent company of Ohio Power Company. All these companies were making an investment decision in these coal plants. And through the electric distribution utilities regulated by the PUCO, a charge was being placed on Ohio ratepayers to bail out the costs of the OVEC plants. So that brings us to House Bill 15. House Bill 15 was passed, and Kevin's going to talk a little bit about how it was passed and what that process looked like. But this is an incredible victory for Ohio to have a really a comprehensive energy bill that changed a whole lot of things. But the thing that I'm going to focus on primarily is the repeal of that OVEC bailout, that OVEC charge. That is one of the most important things that was eliminated by HB 15 and is a real win for Ohioans, a real win for Ohioan pocketbooks, and also levels the playing field when it comes to how certain energy sources are being viewed in Ohio. And that'll be effective August 14th, 2025, by the way. The OVEC repeal is immediate. And that's where we get into the statutory sections of HB 15. We're going to get a little legal wonky for a second here. But so in HB 15, there is Section 3, which completely and utterly repeals Revised Code 4928.148, which authorized up to $1.50 charge on utility bills for residential customers, and then other various formulas for charges for other classes of customers. So you can see that here. Section 3 repealed a whole bunch of other sections of the code as well, but specifically 4928.148, which from HB 6 previously had authorized a non-bypassable rate mechanism established by the Commission for recovery of the costs all the way through 2030. So this cost was going to go all the way to 2030, and we've now cut it off halfway through the decade. Now, RC 4928.148 also required an audit overseen by the Commission of those costs allocated to customers. And relevant to this is that those audits are in active litigation right now. The OEC is actually engaged in the litigation around those audits and the decisions and conclusions of the Commission. If you want to learn more about that litigation, we can share you links to those briefs and the arguments going on there. But the short of it is that OEC is one of those parties. We're appealing some of the legal conclusions of the Commission regarding the audits of the OVEC charges. Among other issues, were essentially arguing that the Commission was supposed to review both the prudence and the reasonableness of those charges allocated to customers, and they only reviewed prudence. So for the attorneys out there, if you want to go read some briefs and learn more about those arguments that are going on, feel free to dive in. But the point being is that HB 6 had created this system to charge Ohio customers for the expenses of these old coal plants, and HB 15 has completely eliminated that cost. So those audits of the expenses will still occur because those expenses already occurred over the past few years. But moving forward, no more charges placed upon Ohio customers under the law. So other notable HB 15 benefits that I'm going to highlight before I kick it over to Kevin to talk a little bit more about the bill. Advanced transmission technology. This is a really, really great inclusion in the bill because if we're going to modernize our electric grid and we're going to bring on new renewable energy and other important energy infrastructure such as battery energy storage, we need more advanced transmission technology. Our transmission grid is also aging. So Section 7 of House Bill 15 instructs the Commission to conduct a study to evaluate the potential use of deployment of advanced transmission technologies. And you can see that there's a variety of other sections that reference advanced transmission technologies in HB 15, such as ensuring that when new electric generation gets put to the grid, the Ohio Power Siting Board has an instruction to instruct those applicants for, say, a new solar plant to be assessing whether or not they can implement advanced transmission technologies into their applications. And major utility facilities must also evaluate the potential for advanced transmission technologies. HB 15 also eliminates electric security plans and replaces them with multi-year rate cases. This is referenced in various sections throughout the bill, but essentially we've had a variety of different mechanisms that the Commission is supposed to use over the past few decades for regulating the electric distribution utilities. And now we're going to have a little bit more of a standardized process where every 3 years, there's a schedule for how frequently these cases are supposed to occur. The utilities are constantly coming back to the Commission for review of their operations and their costs on a very consistent schedule, as you can see, not later than December 31st, 2029, and at least every 3 years thereafter. Each electric distribution utility shall file a rate case application regarding distribution service, which is a huge improvement to the kind of haphazard schedule that was followed previously. So other additional important provisions, there's enhanced data transparency for electric distribution utilities. So not later than May 31st, 2026, every electric distribution utility in the state shall develop and publicly share distribution system hosting capacity maps. We're talking about a public transparency need when it comes to how our electric grid is regulated. The utilities will now have to provide these maps to the public so that energy decisions can be made more effectively. When it comes to understanding how the grid is working, the public will have access to this information. There will also be annual reliability reports that the electric distribution utilities must provide to the Commission, as well as transmission facility heat maps. This is really important transparency to how the electric distribution utilities operate. And then we also have, and this one's really cool, and I'm really excited about this one, a solar loan program for schools. When we think about ensuring that school districts have the ability to provide efficient electricity for their operations, school buildings are pretty big and they've got flat roofs, and they've potentially got, or maybe they've got, some land attached to the school building that may be really good for solar that they can then utilize to subsidize the cost of electricity for the school or the district, and save the district money, put that money back into educating kids. And so there's been a loan program that's been authorized through this bill to use some dollars that were actually originally created through HB 6 once again, but they've just been sitting in a fund. There's been no mechanism to use them, and now a mechanism has been identified for how those dollars are supposed to be used. So I want to talk for a really quick second a little bit more about enhanced transparency and how that could counteract grid investment disparities. So these grid investment disparity, these grid investments and the public transparency that we're going to get out of HB 15 matters because we haven't had good public data that reveals disparity in our electric grid. So over the past year or so, the OEC worked with the Interstate Renewable Energy Council to produce a report reviewing electric grid disparities for communities in First Energy territory. That's up in northern Ohio. It was incredibly difficult to acquire the data needed to produce this report, but IREC was able, after a lot of work, to put together a data set that revealed some unfortunate problems up in First Energy's territory. So you can see that disadvantaged communities were twice as likely to have low voltage circuits. Disadvantaged communities were 10.5% less, had 10.5% less normal circuit capacity and 23% less overload circuit capacity. That's kind of a fancy way of just saying like there's less electricity flowing through the wires, and if things were to overload, there's less capacity to handle that. And then circuits into disadvantaged communities are also on average 3.4 to 4.2 years older than other communities. But potentially most importantly is that traditional metrics for measuring grid reliability failed to notice these disparities between communities. In HB 15, some of those new reliability reports that are now required are going to get at this issue and provide more information so that the Public Utilities Commission can better regulate the electric utilities, but then also the public can understand better about the issues that are facing their electric utility. So with that, that is the end of my section. We're going to do our first poll question now before we kick it over to Kevin. So Jessica, can you start the first poll question, which is the question about what electric utility people are in? And you can share the results at the end, but this will give us a good idea of where people are coming from in Ohio. I'm kind of curious on this. Also, maybe people don't know too. Maybe you just pay your electric bill. You don't really pay attention to what who your electric utility is. We'll give it about 30 seconds to make sure. Remember, attorneys, if you're seeking CLE credit, you need to make sure that you answer this poll question so that we know that you're here and paying attention. All right, Jessica, we can probably end the poll if you want to show the results. All right, looks like a good distribution across the state. This is great. I love to see we've got some electric cooperative folks that are tuning in as well. So great. All right, Kevin.
Thanks, Chris. And before I get into the meat of my presentation, I just want to piggyback on a lot of what Chris said, but particularly the hosting capacity maps and heat maps. Certainly, we're going to illuminate problems in disadvantaged communities, but with an economic development lens too, it also provides opportunities for companies and businesses looking to locate in Ohio. They can find where there is additional capacity on the grid. They can find where there's good transmission lines nearby, and that can help really an issue that a lot of legislative leaders and elected officials have noticed, which is a lot of the economic development has been in central Ohio, and especially if you look at large load users like data centers, we're seeing it really a lot of that is in central Ohio now. There are data centers outside of Ohio or central Ohio. There was one being announced, or one was announced just a few weeks ago in Bowling Green. So they are spreading out, but we think that kind of making the information available about hosting capacity maps and heat maps will make it easier for large energy users to cite their projects and hopefully spread out the where those projects are being located. So really a positive part of House Bill 15, which really has a lot of positive parts. And with that, we can kind of just dive into the backdrop of the conversation on House Bill 15 and its legislative journey. So I wanted to kind of provide some context of what the conversation was like prior to the introduction of House Bill 15 and Senate Bill 2, which is an important bill that ultimately did not get signed into the law, but helped the conversation move forward really in a quick fashion. So at the end of last year and really probably a little bit before that, there was this ringing of the alarm bells of the lack of generation capacity and these kind of looming shortfalls that are resulting from the lack of generation coming online, new generation coming online. And how it's been described to me previously is, if you look at generation facilities like a conveyor belt, like at a grocery store, you have a lot of older generation facilities that can fall off that conveyor belt. And as new capacity comes on that conveyor belt, we weren't seeing the it match kind of what was falling off of the that conveyor belt. And so this shortfall in generation in energy coming online was coupled with the fact that we're seeing this increased demand for energy. And that graph is going to be hard to read, but really just the top line that I reason for including it is you can see that they're projecting some pretty substantial growth in energy demand after a period over pretty much just the turn of the century of relatively flat demand for energy growth. So when you look at lack of generation coming online and you couple that with increasing demand, legislators were concerned. You had some not even really sugarcoating it, saying, there will be blackouts. It's going to look like, Republican legislators saying it's going to look like California. We're going to have these brownouts, and we need to do something. And that conversation happened informally, but it also happened in formal settings. So for those who might not be aware, the Ohio legislature and the Pennsylvania legislature held several joint energy committee meetings where they discussed this increasing energy demand and lack of supply. Folks that testified at those hearings included now U.S. Senator John Husted. You had PJM, our regional transmission office. We had the PUCO testify, the Ohio Chamber, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and a variety of other different entities and stakeholders participated in those hearings to highlight what what they felt from their perspective needed to be done to address shortfalls in capacity for new generation and to meet that demand. And then really what was the last conversation that some legislators were talking about were, should we just allow public utilities to rate-based building generation facilities? So that would, really undo everything that Chris highlighted in that deregulatory phase that Ohio's had since the turn of the century and bring it back to the way it was prior to, which, would have allowed, I guess, the perspective of the legislators were, look, it's expensive to build generation facilities. We know we need it now. How about we just let the utilities do it? We know they would do it. They obviously have a mechanism to pay for it. So we should consider that. And that really was kind of the end of the conversation in 2024, other than, there were two bills being pushed right at the end. One was House Bill 79, an energy efficiency program that I know a lot of folks on this call, and I know that OEC was really pushing for. And then the other was a virtual net metering bill. I believe it was Senate Bill 275, sponsored by Senator Matt Dolan. Both of those bills were moving through the legislative process. They were set to be voted out of the Senate Energy Committee like at the last week of session. And then kind of unceremoniously, they were pulled from the agenda. And the feedback we got was, we're building an energy bill. We're going to have an all-encompassing energy bill coming next year. And so they kind of pushed all of that onto the new General Assembly here in Ohio, which started at the beginning of 2025. And so that is the backdrop that I think it's important to kind of understand the conversation that really will, I think, illustrate why House Bill 15 ended up the way it did. So we can go to the next slide talking about the policy aims of the legislature, the kind of before we dive into some of the players and the process and what's in the bill. So during those conversations late last year and earlier this year, it became apparent that really they weren't going to go towards that one suggested approach of letting utilities rate-based generation. They wanted to attract private capital investment to build these generation facilities. They wanted to lower taxes on generation because what they found out was, I think, as legislators were learning about kind of how the energy markets and how energy is purchased, energy is purchased at an auction, and the cost of the energy encompasses all aspects of what it takes to produce that electron, and that includes taxation. And so their perspective was, how can we incentivize people buying Ohio produced energy and our legislature loves a tax cut, and so they were looking to lower taxes on generation to lower the price ultimately of Ohio produced generation and to hopefully spur more development and more people buying Ohio energy. They also wanted a quicker siting process. And again, this is all sort of with the eye towards we need generation now. And I think they had heard a lot about regulatory lag, both at the PUCO and well, for siting at the OPSB, and they wanted to address that. And so they didn't really preview how, but they wanted to make sure that the process for siting energy was faster. Notably, they did not reference wanting to eliminate some of the local decision making that can sometimes be a hindrance to the siting of, I mean, really particularly solar, um, thanks to a bill that passed a few years ago, Senate Bill 52. They also wanted to remove subsidies for generation. So that kind of not that hints at the OVEC subsidy repeal. It also hints at the solar generation fund and the renewable credits that the I think it was ended up being 6 projects that were eligible for the fund were receiving for generation that was produced in Ohio from those projects. And then they also wanted to encourage behind the meter generation. So behind the meter generation is something that we'll talk a lot about here, but it's essentially, it's energy generation and facilities that don't rely on the existing infrastructure to move or distribute the energy that's produced there. So it's on the customer side of the meter, which makes it behind the meter. So, those were the broad aims of the legislature heading into 2025. And what you'll see is House Bill 15 really hit on pretty much all of these. And one thing maybe before we talk about the players is I think there was a lot of angst amongst a lot of stakeholders about how House Bill 15 would treat different types of energy generation. Like we had sort of heard that the natural gas industry was really the big push behind this bill and had maybe perhaps had the pen in their hand for drafting it. So there was a lot of concern, from renewable developers and from businesses and large energy users that this bill would really just target natural gas development at the exclusion of other generation sources. And what you'll see, absent maybe one little provision, the legislature, I think, to their credit, absolutely their credit, they treat all energy generation sources the same under this bill, which, I think was turning the page on what we saw in House Bill 6, where it was very clear, we wanted to prioritize these nuclear power plants. And then, they ended up finding their way to helping some coal-fired power plants as well. And so it felt like maybe the legislature was going to repeat itself with that type of, I guess, prioritization. But ultimately, that did not become the case. So want to keep going on the legislative process here and talk about the players. So, what I do on a day-to-day basis is I lobby these folks at the State House on a variety of different issues. And so knowing who these people are for me is important. And I think for you guys, maybe who aren't engaging in legislative politics on a day-to-day basis, it's nice to kind of just have a little bit of primer about who these folks are and to help you kind of maybe better understand how we got to where we went. So on the top are the senators that were involved, and the bottom are the House members that were involved. And as a former Senate staffer, I of course had to put the Senate on top because they are the upper chamber. So the first gentleman on your screen is Senate President Rob McCauley. He is the leader of the Senate, and it's important that he had been buying into this idea of a large omnibus energy bill. The next person there is Senator Bill Reineke. Senator Reineke and Senator Shane Wilkin were the bill sponsors of Senate Bill 2, which again did not get enacted into law, but had about 80% of what was in House Bill 15 was in Senate Bill 2. There were some varieties, but really what the Senate Bill 2 allowed to happen was concurrent hearings and concurrent debate happening in the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate at the same time so that the legislature could move quickly on this bill, which ultimately they did. And then Senator Brian Chavez, chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, obviously had a large part to play in the drafting of Senate Bill 2 and House Bill 15. On the bottom, Speaker Matt Huffman, former Senate president. He's in his first term in the House, but he is as Speaker, leads the chamber for the Republicans. You have Representative Adam Holmes, the chairman of the House Energy Committee, and Rep. Roy Klopfenstein, the sponsor of House Bill 15. And these individuals have a variety of different backgrounds. Some of them are small business owners, some of them are attorneys, some of them have an energy experience background with Senator Chavez, working with natural gas companies, I believe. And then you have some retailers and business owners here. We can then kind of go into the legislative process and more in depth. So we're kind of going to leave Senate Bill 2 aside now and just focus on House Bill 15 since that was the bill that ultimately became law. It was introduced in late January, ultimately was assigned to the House Energy Committee, where they held 7 hearings. Those 7 hearings resulted in a robust committee conversation, a committee record. And ultimately, because of the provisions that I'm about to talk about, it had a lot of support. Really, at the end of the day, the only opponents that remained were the state's investor-owned utilities. Everyone else pretty much got on board, and that is something that we don't see a lot of in energy policy at the PUCO. The fact that OEC and other groups that frequently find themselves on different sides of the table, all lined up to say, please pass House Bill 15, I think shows that this was a bill that really addresses the policy that everyone could buy into and that the state needed. It ultimately passed the committee with 1 dissenting vote and then passed the House by a 92-3 vote in late March, March 26th. Those 3 votes and the no votes were in the footprint of those OVEC power plants. And so, they stood up and said, not really opposing the other parts of the bill, but this direct impact on my community. And so those were the reasons for the no votes. The Senate moved much quicker. There were 2 hearings on House Bill 15 in the Senate Energy Committee. The bill was assigned to them on April 2nd, and by the end of the month, it passed unanimously out of both the committee and the chamber. But what it's not on the screen is the substantial changes that happened along the way. I kind of lost track. I was trying to do some forensic accounting, if you will, before this meeting, but I believe there was 9 different sub bills, maybe 8 that were public, that reformed provisions of House Bill 15 to ultimately the version that we're going to talk about and that became law. And so those different versions, I think, highlight the collaborative nature and approach that the legislature took with House Bill 15. So that is kind of the backdrop and the legislative process on House Bill 15. And Chris, I mean, there's questions coming in. Should I keep going, or how do we want to handle that?
Keep going through your section, and then we'll answer the questions at the end.
Got it. So, what is in the bill? So the next few slides will talk about, the provisions of the bill, and give you a little bit more backdrop. There's a lot in there. It was a 200-page bill, so we're not going to touch upon all of it. And, I'm summarizing the major provisions too. So even what we summarize isn't the full story. But I think at a broad strokes, there's some really positive aspects of the bill. So first, this behind the meter generation. If you recall, they wanted to encourage the development of behind the meter generation, especially for large energy users. Their thought process was, we have these large energy users, data centers coming in, and they're kind of straining the grid, straining our capacity to deliver energy elsewhere, which I think some in the industry would disagree with, but nonetheless, that was their prevailing view. And so they looked to do a few different things to encourage that development. So first, they relaxed the requirements on where self-generators and their facilities can locate. So a self-generator is an entity, really any business entity that generates power for their own consumption. Previously, though the facilities for self-generators had to be located on property they owned, House Bill 15 expanded that to be property they own or control. So think leases. And then secondarily, prior to House Bill 15, self-generator facilities, they had to be operated by the self-generator themselves, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Like if you're a large energy user, you're not necessarily, an owner and operator of generation facilities. So what they did here was they expanded that to say it could be owners or the agents of the self-generator could be the one that owns and operates these generation facilities. It establishes a mercantile customer self power system classification, and this is just a form of self generator. It applies to large mercantile customers, which are customers that have 700,000 megawatts, or sorry, kilowatt hours in annual usage. And what it did there is it kind of expanded so that where the self generator, it had to be, one entity producing generation for themselves. The mercantile customer self power systems allowed multiple mercantile customers to they don't use this word, but subscribe and draw power from that one facility. And then also, it allows any entity to own or operate these self-power systems. So it doesn't have to be the owner and operator, or it doesn't have to be the owner of the whoever's using the energy. It doesn't have to be their agent. It can be any entity. So this really allows those independent power producers to come in and produce and build these self-generation facilities behind the meter. And then to really assure that this self-regulated this deregulated market continues, the House Bill 15 prohibits utilities from owning behind the meter generation unless the utility had already filed a application at the PUCO. That was there because AEP Ohio is working with Amazon on a pretty cool project on fuel cells to power a Amazon data center here in Central Ohio. So there are some utility rate making reforms. They prohibit offering settlement inducements. What we see frequently in some of these ESPs and other PUCO proceedings is the utility will offer some financial incentives or some private arrangements to the intervening parties to get them to agree to the settlement. That is prohibited now under House Bill 15. It authorizes rebates for unlawful utility charges. So a case from the 1950s here at Ohio Supreme Court said that utilities don't have to rebate charges that are later found unlawful because at the time that they were charging them, they were lawful. They were approved by the PUCO. And so this created this scenario where you would get a decision that said this charge is unlawful, and then the utility is like, well, we collected the money, we're not rebating it. And so that kind of fairness argument came into play. They addressed that by saying from the date of the decision that says the charge is unlawful to the date that ultimately the rebates are made, that the utility shall pay those rebates out. Mandates competitively bid and market rate standard service offerings. So really what this means is utilities can no longer kind of self-select who they want to work with, where they want to buy power from. They have to, create a standardized process. They have to have a standard solicitation standard, and they have to solicit bids from anyone. And then there's a third party evaluation or third party evaluating everything to make sure that, it adheres to, the regulations and the law. This was an option prior to House Bill 15. This is now mandatory for utilities to do in their standard service offerings. We can skip the base load facility here. Um, so the PUCO and Ohio Power Siting Board shot clocks. This deals with we need generation now, and this regulatory lag that really it was real. We at Dickinson, right? We do a lot of siting projects, and really the fastest you could ever see a project get sited is in a year. More likely, you're at 18 months to 2 years, and that just wasn't fast enough for the legislature. So for the OPSB, they require them to issue a certificate within 45 days. I'm sorry, within 150 days after determining an application is complete. They have 45 days to determine an application is complete. So you're looking at right about 200 days, 195 days from application filing to a decision if everyone's doing what they should be doing on the front end. And then similarly, on rate making cases, requires the PUCO to issue a staff report within 180 days. That staff report is essentially, hey, we as PUCO staff think this is a good deal, a bad deal. You should approve it, you should deny it. And then it requires the PUCO itself, so the commissioners, to approve, deny, or modify the application within 360 days. So just shy of 1 year. And we talked a lot about advanced transmission technology, so not going to dive into it, but do want to highlight just quickly kind of two major technologies in this space, and that's dynamic line rating and advanced reconductoring. So dynamic line rating, what it does is it's really like this kind of new idea where if they can put a technology on a wire that can then monitor in real time the capacity that that particular transmission line has, then grid operators can turn up that capacity, knowing that there's room and it can be done safely when the demand on the grid is really high. And then advanced reconductoring really is just switching out the wires. So right now, a lot of these wires are steel and they lose some juice as they go from point A to point B. If they can use carbon fiber or other, technologies or other materials, they can lose less juice as it goes from point A to point B. And so, you know, together, both of those allow us and our grid to get more power out of the same, capacity that we're currently producing, which helps everyone. And ultimately, these can be done quickly. If we're building new transmission lines, it goes through a siting process, and it can take 7 to 10 years. These can be done quickly, cheaply, and easily. So, wanted to highlight that too. Brownfield developments. So, brownfields are these former industrial sites that have challenges for economic development because there's hazardous material, there. And then I guess kind of jumping around a little bit, but that's one component of this priority investment area. So priority investment areas are spots either that are brownfields or former coal mines, which pretty self-explanatory what that is, that a local government passes an ordinance and urges and requests the Department of Development to designate that brownfield or former coal mine as a priority investment area. Department of Development reviews or has an application process. We believe they'll probably approve most of these. And at that point, that area is now a priority investment area. The key parts of being designated a priority investment area is all the property there that's used to transmit and produce electricity is tax exempt for 5 years. And the project that's being built there is eligible to receive $10 million in grant funding from the state. And the third piece is it's a much faster review by the Power Siting Board. Within 90 days, 45 days from determination of completeness, 45 days, 45 days to determine it's complete, 45 days after determination of completeness, the OPSB must have approved, denied the project in that priority investment area. So if you're looking at 90 days compared to about 150 days or 195 days, if it's not in a priority investment area, it's much, much faster. And the tax piece here, this is one component. It's complicated, and so they don't want to go too far into the weeds. But if you think about trying to lower those taxes, both production equipment and energy conversion equipment had a 24% tax rate. It is now 7% under House Bill 15. Production equipment is equipment used to generate, store, or release electricity. Store is for batteries. It was not previously in the definition of production equipment until House Bill 15, but they added it in there for clarity and consistency. Energy conversion equipment, think renewable, think solar, wind, those technologies that turn wind and solar into electricity. So what's not in the bill? There's no House Bill 79, broad-based opt-out energy efficiency program, and there's not a demand response program. One version of Senate Bill 2 that the Senate passed had a voluntary residential demand response program that provided customers who opted into the program a $40 yearly credit if they participated in the program. Participation would mean that in periods of high demand, the utility or the grid operator could lower your thermostat by, I believe, 2 or 3 degrees to help make sure that the grid remains stable. There was no community energy program. That was in House Bill 15 at one point. Think community solar, but because they wanted to be energy agnostic, they called it community energy. So any fuel source, so it could be natural gas or solar, could participate in a community energy program where subscribers could participate and draw energy from that program. Similar is the virtual net metering. There was no Senate Bill 275 like bill in House Bill 15. So wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. So hopefully that wasn't too quick.
No, I think we're good, Kevin. We've got a few questions that we can go through. I've been taking some notes on some of the questions that people have already asked. You may have some answers too. One of them you already partially answered. Kathy Kowalski was asking about examples of advanced transmission technologies. So you already answered that part of her question. But so I'll answer the second two parts. She kind of asked a three-parter. So she also asked, what are the benefits for the environment in terms of cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to advanced transmission technologies? And so I think the short answer on that for folks is that when we have a more efficient grid, when we're able to move electricity in real time, you're cutting out inefficiencies where there may be power that's like on the grid but not being sent to the right place. And so having those sorts of real-time sensors that Kevin was talking about, you're able to move electricity more efficiently, which may mean that you don't have to turn on or pull from that coal plant that could be fired. Instead, you're just pulling from the solar, the wind technologies that are going on during peak hours of the day. And so that's one example of how greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced from advanced transmission technologies, as well as then also just the health impacts that come with not putting more dirty air up into the atmosphere. And then the other question that was asked from Kathy was, what are the advantages for ratepayers? And then she also asked, and how do you fight utilities' tendency for gold plating capital projects? I think is a good question. The short answer I have there is that, more advanced generation technology means a more reliable grid and a more efficient grid, which means less expenses for dealing with those issues, which then means, if high cost generation doesn't get activated as much, rates may stabilize. They don't have to ask for as much money from ratepayers to deal with those issues. But what this looks like in practice, and I really want to emphasize this, HB 15 is putting all these rules into place. But what this actually looks like really depends on implementation of the PUCO. It really depends on how the Public Utilities Commission continues to regulate these entities through these 3-year rate cases. That is what's going to matter, and that's where OEC, our legal team, is going to be in a lot of those cases. There's other parties that are in those cases, playing roles. Ohio Consumers Council intervenes in those cases to try and advocate for consumers. What it actually looks like in practice to ensure that the expenses don't balloon in different ways is really going to depend on the implementation of the PUCO.
Yeah, and Chris, there too, it's those technologies can make it so that you don't have to build new transmission facilities and new transmission and distribution lines. And so of those cost avoided projects can help keep costs low for ratepayers.
Yeah, great. That's a good addition as well. So our next question that we have is someone, Mark Bank asked, I heard low voltage wires can pose a greater risk to the health of those they serve. Can you speak to this? So Kevin, you may have more on this. My short answer is that I don't know about like health risks from the wires themselves, but what I can say is that if a community doesn't have great grid infrastructure and a blackout occurs or there's a heat wave that occurs that causes um, electricity go down in a community, that can pose health risks because you may have, a person who relies on oxygen and needs electricity to live. And, if they lose their electricity, that can be a direct health impact for that person. Or if you need, it's a high heat day, 105 degrees, somebody has an additional health issue that they're dealing with and their electricity goes down and they can't run their AC and then suddenly it's 95 degrees in their house. That's a health impact. So I can't speak to the wires themselves, but I can speak to those sorts of health impacts that come with, having less electric grid infrastructure in your community. Kevin, do you have anything else to add on that question? No, great. Okay, so this might be a good question for you, Kevin. We have regarding behind the meter generation. Can the generation serve multiple accounts, kind of like virtual net metering, so long as the owner lesser of those accounts, land/land, are the same entity? Can that entity be a sub metering entity? That comes from Matt Robert.
Sure. Um, so this is where that mercantile self-power system and customer comes into play. So for a small energy user, they can't serve multiple accounts. But for the larger energy users, um, multiple entities can draw power from that behind the meter generation facility. Um, and it doesn't have to be, the same entity. It can be, entity A can own the facility and entities B, C, and D can draw power from it. Um, Less sure about the sub-metering aspect of that. That's something I don't spend a lot of time on, so don't want to comment and afraid to say something wrong.
No worries. Yeah, that's totally fair. Jessica, we're right at 11:59, so we can maybe answer a few more questions. But while we're doing that, let's run that last poll question for those seeking CLE credit. So what concerns you most about Ohio's electric grid? Maybe you've learned a little bit more about a few issues today as you've been listening, or maybe there's a particular issue that's in your mind already. But while we dive into some of these other questions, let's go ahead and answer that question. So we have Ben from Lucas County asked, are there any incentives to encourage energy conservation by the consumer? In HB 15 itself, nothing is coming to mind right off the top of my head. I will say that so that wasn't included in HB 15. I will say there have been some recent PUCO decisions though that have created some new energy conservation opportunities for consumers. So if you're in AEP Ohio's territory, for instance, here in Columbus, they just rolled out a new smart thermostat program that actually is a voluntary demand response program through smart thermostats, where you can, if you have a smart thermostat, you can sign up for your smart thermostat to adjust its electric output, like so essentially how much electricity your home is using. If there's like a high energy day, you can actually sign up for it to automatically increase what your AC is set to, so actually decrease the amount of energy being used. And if you sign up for that, you actually I think there's like a gift card you get or something like that, or some sort of credit on your bill. I forget the exact details of that. So there are some energy conservation programs that are being implemented by some of the utilities, but we don't have anything in statute yet and I think that's one of those things people hoped for through those energy efficiency programs that Kevin was talking about at the end that didn't make it into the bill. And that's something that I think folks will still be advocating for going forward. And then Kevin, I think this question was probably for you.
Yep.
Someone asked, I thought standard service auctions already used a competitive bidding process. Could you talk a bit more about what's happening currently and what's changing?
Sure. So, prior to House Bill 15, utilities had the option to use market rate offers and competitive bidding processes for their SSO, but it was entirely optional. So utilities very well could have availed themselves to that process, but they also could have used a different process. Now it's a mandatory requirement that they have to use that competitive bidding process. And then, why no net metering? I think ultimately there's not a sufficient amount of support in the legislature for it right now. I think it's just the brass tacks of it. I know there's positive benefits to it, but when you look at the groups that are supporting it and the groups that are opposing it, there's a bit of an unalignment the issue there where there's a few more opponents than proponents.
So we are at 12:03, and I want to be cognizant of folks' time. For those who are seeking CLE credit, we will expect a communication from me after this. It'll include some next steps as well as just a very brief survey to meet those requirements that we have. But I want to thank everyone for your time. I will just note someone's last question about the federal administration's emphasis on reviving coal generation. My very quick, brief answer to that is that the federal administration is doing things around electricity. We're doing stuff at the state level. And when it comes to that implementation comment I made earlier, yes, there may be efforts to push for coal up at the federal level. But when it comes to what HB 15 did, HB 15 is energy agnostic for the most part. And so those implementation timelines, they apply to solar, they apply to other energy opportunities as well. So like, yes, someone could pursue coal, they could pursue natural gas, they could pursue solar, they could pursue wind. Us as advocates at the state level, if you don't want to see coal and natural gas, advocate for the solar and wind. It's energy agnostic, which is a huge shift from what we had previously, where we had written into law a bailout for a coal plant. So to that extent, HB 15 is moving us away from coal. So with that, Kevin, any last words before we hop off?
No, thank you for the invite and hope everyone found the presentation useful.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in.